Good evening, everyone. And really, thank you so much, Karen, for such a beautiful reflection of this loving relationship between our two sister nations. So, as was mentioned, this year is the 100th anniversary of our joint National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. So it's been 1 century, and tonight's panel is going to be reflecting on those 100 years, reflecting on our institutional development, reflecting on the evolving capacity of the Baha'i community to contribute to the spiritual and social transformation across North America. As many of you know, there are significant efforts underway across the continent, learning how to create models of unity in neighborhoods and communities and havens of hope for people of every race, creed, and background. The Baha'i community has sought to embody a distinctive system of governance that integrates principles such as consultation, equality, unity, and it's a system that has been designed to guide the advancement of civilization. So our panelists tonight will explore how this system of Baha'i administration operates today in a mode of systematic learning, and we'll also consider how some of these insights from the Baha'i administrative process, both in the US and Canada, can advance contributions in our academic and professional discourses. But first, we're going to begin with a film. And this is a 20-minute film that's going to trace this journey over the course of 100 years. It's going to start with the roots of the Baha'i administrative order in North America, from Baha'u'llah's call to America, to the laying of the temple cornerstone by Abdu'l-Baha, and then follow the remarkable evolution of our joint National Spiritual Assembly into the 2 distinct bodies that it now is today of the United States and Canada. So we'll watch the film first, and then I'll introduce to you our panelists for tonight. So let's begin with the film.
In a prison city on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, in this modest room, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Bahá'í Faith, provided a vision for a fully prosperous world. It is a vision in which we learn to leave behind conflict, division, and oppression. Baha'u'llah provided the spiritual teachings, principles, institutions, laws, and practices that would help us move forward towards a lasting peace. In his summons, he called upon the North American continent, and the US in particular, to play a special role.
Baha'is understand that religion is progressive, that the cause of God, as Baha'is think about it, is one thing. We've called it Judaism, we've called it Zoroastrianism, we've called it Buddhism, we've called it Christianity, we've called it Islam, and now we call it the Baha'i Faith. But we understand that all of these religions are from the same God. And we understand that they are progressive. That is, as human beings evolved, as our societies became more complex, as the problems we faced became more challenging, there was a need for a fresh infusion of spiritual energy and instructions from God about how to organize society at a higher level of complexity and competence.
The idea that the Baha'i Faith had an organization went back to Baha'u'llah. He himself ordained an administrative order that would have governing councils and a supreme governing body who he said he would always guide. This is the first time that we know in religious history that a messenger of God has ordained institutions, not individuals, but institutions, to continue their religion after their passing.
And so the Baha'i Faith brings us teachings that are specifically designed to help us understand the forces that are reorganizing the world, what those forces are, how they work, and the work that they're going to do, and to give us specific instructions about how to unify the nations, how to deal with ecological imbalance, how to deal with racial prejudice and gender discrimination, how to deal with the whole issue of a spiritual solution to economic disparities. All those issues are the issues of modernity.
Baha'u'llah's vision required a renewal of the institutions of governance. His teachings laid out a new pattern of administration which the Baha'i community has been building around the world. Under the direction of Abdul Baha, the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, the appointed head of the faith, the Baha'is in America established the first Western assemblies, the local governing bodies that would lay the groundwork for future institutions. A decade later, in 1909, a small group of Baha'is gathered in Chicago to consult on the building of the first Baha'i house of worship in the Western world.
So this very special meeting that really was the seed of what would later become the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States and Canada was held on the first day of spring, the beginning of the Baha'i New Year, March 21st, 1909.
With much of the holy writing still untranslated, naturally, the early Baha'is drew on the organizational processes and standards they were already familiar with.
Some of them had some misunderstandings themselves about basic Baha'i teachings. One was that women could not serve on Baha'i assemblies. That was totally wrong and in contradiction to the Baha'i principle of the equality of men and women. And the vast majority of believers were women.
One of those women was Kathryn, who visited Abdu'l-Baha in 1907. She was surprised when he asked her to oversee the building of the temple. Later, 3 men from the Bahá'í Temple Unity Committee visited Abdu'l-Baha and asked him about the temple.
His reply was, "I've given all the instructions to Mrs. True. You must ask her." So they had to abolish the men's committee and the women's committee and have one committee with both sexes.
Kathryn would see Abdu'l-Baha 5 years later in 1912 when he arrived in the United States and spent 239 days spreading his father's teachings. And in Chicago, he laid the cornerstone for the new house of worship. As Abdu'l-Baha broke ground at the temple site, he called for several women to come forward, and then one by one, individuals from a multitude of races and nationalities.
Then in 1921, Abdu'l-Baha fairly suddenly passed away.
Abdu'l-Baha's passing was devastating for the worldwide Baha'i community and for his grandson Shoghi Effendi, who was now designated the head of the Baha'i world.
Now, in early 1922, the Baha'i world finds its new leader is this young man who is a graduate student and age 24.
Shoghi Effendi called for the establishment of local assemblies wherever 9 or more Baha'is reside and directed that Baha'i community activities be placed under their authority. 3 years later, it was time to elect the first National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada.
In 1925, a group of Americans and Canadians came together at a retreat center in Maine with a very noble and unique purpose: to establish, after years of struggle, a governing body that they knew would transform the world. It is absolutely marvelous to look at the photographs, the group photographs of the 1925 convention. It's predominantly women, but it is racially, socially, ethnically diverse. It's incredible because This was the opposite of what was happening in the United States as a whole.
It was a time of intense racial conflict in the United States. We had just come out of the Red Summers, where there was literally racial warfare in 37 cities throughout the United States. Now, in that environment, the American Baha'i community was just beginning to develop, and it had very specific instructions from the head of the faith that we were to build a racially integrated spiritual community. You can imagine what a challenge that was in the context of what was happening at the time.
When the votes were counted, the new 9-member assembly included 2 women, Florence Morton and Amelia Collins. 2 years later, Louis Gregory would join the assembly, and over the succeeding decades, it would continue to represent the diversity of the American continent itself.
One of the fundamental beliefs of the Baha'i Faith is that there is a direct relationship between the equality of Black and white Americans and the development of world peace. And if you think about it from a poetic standpoint, it is beautiful symmetry in a spiritual context. And what could be more spiritually and metaphorically and practically perfect than that being the seed of the unity of all humanity?
Shoghi Effendi would later refer to the American Baha'i community as the cradle of the administrative order. How we would learn as a species to govern ourselves for the whole world.
When you then have the structure of the Baha'i Faith, which does not have clergy, we have elected institutions that are elected by one person, one vote, and everybody's eligible. There's no campaigning, there's no nomination, and there's no self-promotion or any other thing. So this is a brand new vision for the leadership of a spiritual community. And so you have local spiritual assemblies that are elected by the same process at the local level. And then nationally, delegates are elected by the various areas, and they come together to elect the National Spiritual Assembly that oversees the Baha'i affairs on a national scale. But this is a far different arrangement than is traditionally practiced by religions because there's still no individual authority.
For 100 years, the National Assembly and hundreds of local assemblies have been engaged in a countrywide endeavor to bring spiritual principles to every neighborhood. From coast to coast, communities are transforming, youth are rising, and children are being spiritually educated.
I'm Passion, and I'm 8.5. I'm turning 9 October 31st. The prayers you get to sing, and you get to do the prayers that you like. Yeah, it makes me feel like I'm alive.
You see, where we started 100 years ago, the object was just to understand the principles and begin to fashion an administrative organization that would reflect the spirit of the Baha'i Faith itself. In fact, the spirit of all religions. And where we are now is that is sufficiently well established and understood that we can begin to join with others. As we went into the 80s and 90s, the National Spiritual Assembly began to share the Baha'i writings with America at large. So, for example, the National Spiritual Assembly released a series of statements on cornerstone issues that were challenging American society. The first was the statement on race, and it was called America's Most Challenging Issue. It described the Baha'i writings' understanding that this is the time for the unity of the races and the development of one spiritual and human and social family. And so it was a spiritual imperative and a social, political, and economic imperative that the systems that govern human society begin to cultivate an understanding that we are all fundamentally related.
For me, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada is a cause for not only great celebration, because we've come a long way in a century, but also for reflection. The spirit of those early North American believers was incredible. They were on fire with a flame of devotion for a faith that was still very new to them. And they saw the possibility of their efforts, as small as they seemed, to transform the world.
Each one of us is individually responsible to search for truth. Not the way you see it or somebody else sees it, but what is this truth that lies at the root of the purpose of creation by God Himself? And how do I conduct myself? Well, then if you think about those principles as they guide my individual life, you recognize that there needs to be principles that guide the community, the state, the nation, and the world. And those principles have to be inspired and organized in accordance with the same spiritual understandings and spiritual principles, but they have to have practical structures and practical organizations that will allow us to transfer the benefits of cooperation and the benefits of a very high level of problem solving and search for answers to the complex challenges we face, and turn the community into a prosperous and cooperative social order.
Baha'u'llah has envisioned a new and unique system of administration that goes beyond humanity's previous understanding of governance. The assemblies of North America, alongside a steadily growing number of national assemblies around the world, have provided an initial effort to put his vision into practice. There's now evidence that humanity can move beyond deeply dysfunctional and divisive forms of governance, that democratic elections can be held without any form of competition, and that all individuals have the freedom to be heard and participate. It is a system that produces institutions that are able to operate in an ongoing mode of learning, adjusting to changing social conditions, yet never wavering from the foundational values Baha'u'llah has prescribed. Baha'u'llah wrote, "Hearken ye, O rulers of America and the presidents of the republics therein, unto that which the dove is warbling on the branch of eternity." And later he said, "We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations, that all nations should become one in faith, and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened, that diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. So it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come."
So thank you so much for that wonderful film. There was a team of collaborators who pulled this together for us really at the last minute, but it came together really nicely. So thank you. So while we're getting set up here for our panel, I'd like to actually introduce to you our panelists tonight. So they're going to be helping us reflect more deeply on this century of Baha'i administration and its development across North America. So first we have with us Kathy Jewett Hogenson. She is a historian, a lawyer, and author who has written about the establishment of the administrative order through a number of biographies of Hands of the Cause and of the early believers of North America. We also have with us tonight Kenneth E. Bowers, Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, who has served in various capacities at the national level for over 3 decades. Ken is the author of an introductory book on the Baha'i Faith titled God Speaks Again. And finally, we have Dr. Michael Karlberg. Michael is a professor of communication studies at Western Washington University and is the author of books Beyond the Culture of Contest and Constructing Social Reality. So with that, I'm going to invite our 3 panelists to join us here on stage. Hello. Oh, yes. Okay, so welcome to our panelists. Kathy, we're going to start with you tonight. So the Baha'i community, as it has developed and spread around the globe, it's promoted fundamental spiritual principles. The oneness of humanity, the equality of women and men, the elimination of racial prejudice, to name a few. And to the best of their ability, Baha'is have given practical expression to these spiritual principles, and they've labored to liberate communities from the barriers that have historically divided humanity. But we're looking back a century. We're looking back to 1925. And here in North America, this was a time when racial segregation was the law of the land. It was a time when women still lacked full voting rights, and many of today's foundational freedoms were still aspirational. And yet within that context, the Baha'i community gave birth to an administrative system that enshrined unity and equality. So Kathy, can you take us back to that moment? Take us back to the beginnings of the formation of that National Spiritual Assembly. What were the early stages of the development of the Baha'i administrative order? And how has the fruit of the National Spiritual Assembly today been brought to bear over 100 years of effort?
Thank you, Saphira. As a student of history, I've often found it very interesting how very quiet, out-of-the-way incidents can transform the world. As Baha'is, one of the best examples, perhaps the best examples of all examples, is a quiet conversation over tea that took place in a modest residential neighborhood of Shiraz in 1844. That little conversation, one night over tea, set the spark to totally transform God's plan for the world and to bring it about. Nobody knew about it. It was a secret. So, another slightly larger gathering in 1909, the Baha'i New Year in Chicago, 3rd floor of a very large home in Chicago where they normally played billiards. A group of Baha'is from across the North American continent gathered with the goal of building a building. You know, a tangible goal like a building is a very useful tool to get yourself organized. You have to learn lots of skills to build a big building. And this was a very modest group. Most of the people in it had no renown at all. And yet, the seed sowed there in that billiard room would later become the National Spiritual Assembly. And to show you the spiritual power of what happened on that day, half a world away in Haifa, Israel, the sacred remains of the Bab were being laid to rest at the same time, forever connecting the house of worship of North America, the emblem, really, of the administrative order for us, because it was the seed, and the shrine of the Bab. So, this meeting in a billiard room was the seed for establishing a brand new pattern for how all of mankind ultimately will conduct its business. We can't, at this point, even 100 years later, begin to fully appreciate the magnitude of what happened. The Guardian often did refer to the Bahá'í Temple Unity and its executive committee, which filled a vacuum and basically began to manage the affairs of North America because nobody else was there to do it, as the precursor of the true administrative order that would follow in a few years. The executive committee was annually elected by representatives from across the United States, the first Baha'i governing body of a national or international level that was elected in that way. We did have the Central Committee of Tehran, but it was not an elected body. Baha'u'llah talked about assemblies in his most important book, the Kitab-i Aqdas. But it was left to Abdu'l-Baha to put some flesh on those beautiful words and explain a little bit more. And he did so through his will and testament, which was not promulgated until a few months after his passing. Shoghi Effendi first had to translate it, and then there was a whole process of disseminating the will and testament worldwide, but particularly in the West. And in 1922, he called believers from a number of countries to come and consult with him in the Holy Land, and then he sent them home to start establishing elected assemblies, both local and national. Now, as you would expect, the US and Canada elected a national spiritual assembly in 1922. So why are we celebrating it in 2025? And the short answer is, we don't know. Shoghi Effendi said 1925, even though he recognized it in 1922, but he, and God passes by, changed the dates, not only for us, the Germans and the Brits also got the same treatment, and they were a year or two later than when they actually held the first election. But 1925 was especially significant because between 1922 and 1925, we did a census of the American community. Because one of the first questions was, who was a Baha'i? Lots of people were coming to meetings. Who was eligible to vote? So you had to have membership list. Remember, it was the Bab himself who called upon the believers to have membership list. And we kind of had it, but it was not very carefully done, let us put it that way. So we needed to sort of come up with who is in our Baha'i community. And friends, this also, I hate to say it, but because of Abdu'l-Baha's passing, this period of transition made that a more complicated issue than it would have been at another time in history because of the transition that was going on. So we don't know why, but we have to go with Shoghi Effendi's statement, 1925 is it. So that is our celebration. Now, In 1922, when he had the friends gathered with him to discuss what to do next after the passing of the master, he wrote a very important letter. It's in Baha'i administration. It's his first major letter of substance to the believers, but particularly to the North American believers. It's March the 5th, and in this letter, he explained and provided translations of the sacred texts, which we had never seen before, understanding what is this Baha'i administrative order and our elected bodies, and calling upon us to immediately begin to establish them. He talked about the sacredness of their nature, that these are not just committees to figure out how many cookies to buy and how to manage funds. These are divinely ordained, divinely directed institutions. And I know it doesn't feel like that in your local assembly many times, right? But that's what we are, what these assemblies are, and we must never forget that. He also mentioned the wide scope of their activity. Friends, unlike most governments today, we do not have an executive, legislative, and judicial. We only have an assembly. It may delegate some of those powers, but it directs all of those. There is no competition within various activities of an assembly. And he said also that grave responsibility rests on them. We often forget that your local spiritual assembly is not just responsible for the Baha'i community that have elect them and come to feast and so forth. Your local assembly is responsible for the spiritual and material well-being of all of the people of that jurisdiction. The guardian said it is a grave responsibility that rests on them. Baha'u'llah and the Agdas said, "It behooveth them to be the trusted ones of the merciful amongst men, and to regard themselves as the guardians appointed of God for all that dwell on earth." And of course, the guardian in that same letter emphasized a way of making decisions that was not common in mankind's history. Certainly there have been councils of elders. There have been attempts at bringing other people's voices in, what we refer to as democracy, and we'll bring that up in a second. But this idea that everyone has a voice, universal participation, an electoral process that is totally free. This certainly is something that the people of the world long for now. They're often given a slate of people and say, pick between the horrors, you know? This is not how we function. And we function, these bodies have to function in a prayerful manner. They stand before God in the council chamber. They are accountable to God for their decisions. Their work must be based on spiritual principles and oneness. Oneness. So, when this group of very different people first came together in the 1920s, it was extremely diverse. We not only had Louis Gregory, who most of you are very familiar with, a black man from the South whose parents had been born into slavery. He was a lawyer. We had two women, one of whom would serve in the early days as treasurer. This is also very unheard of, that a woman would be given the financial responsibility. But we had our Canadian Fred Schafflacher, a German immigrant who was Jewish. And we forget, anti-Semitism is not new. There were many places in the United States and Canada where Fred Schafflacher was not welcome. And yet he served with distinction on the National Spiritual Assembly as a very vital member. We had other challenges. This was before air travel. One member from California went to a East Coast meeting. It took her 4 days on the fastest train she could get on. We had to have people standing by for delegates who couldn't attend the convention if they needed to vote again. They had to be at a telegraph office. These are the kinds of challenges that they had to deal with. They had very few resources, maybe about 500 active people scattered across North America, more on the rolls, but that. And they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have guidelines for local spiritual assemblies. Shoghi Effendi didn't have all that yet either. We had the Will and Testament and some basic spiritual teachings and consultation. So, Shoghi Effendi used the North Americans as his lab rats, his experimenters, both at the national and local levels. It was an area of the world where there was religious freedom, where our assemblies could function without worrying about what the government was going to do. And we were off everybody's radar. So this is how the Guardian, through trial and error, came up with the administrative order we have today, answering the questions of the North Americans and dealing with the challenges as they arose. And friends, there were lots of challenges, both internal and external. I have, for those of you who remember the 1960s, it doesn't have anything on the 1920s. The 1920s, the Jazz Age, it was a period of great immorality. It was a period where there was tremendous social turmoil, particularly racial, but also women had just gotten the vote but weren't really truly accepted in society. There were great governmental transitions going on as a result of changes that happened during the Wilson administration during World War I. The United States became a much stronger central government. And in 1929, 4 years after the election of the official First National Assembly, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression was on us. It was also a period where in the greater world, as well as in North America, Marxism and fascism were on the rise. So this was a very difficult period. The National Assembly, as it started its teaching work, especially in the South, had to face legal discrimination against the black believers, black community in general. And the question of could white and black believers in the same community come together in a meeting, a racially mixed meeting, and not break the law, was a huge issue. The National Assembly traveled to Tennessee to see firsthand what was going on during that period. In the meantime, it's trying to build this house of worship, this amazing, huge structure. This is not just a little chapel with no money in the Depression. And then the Shoghi Effendi, as he started to develop the Tablets of the Divine Plan, charged this National Assembly with opening the entire Western Hemisphere in 7 years. 7 years to do it. And the National Assembly and the New York City Assembly, which is why it's in that film, developed the charters for all local and national assemblies, the Declaration of Trust for all national assemblies, and the bylaws for a local spiritual assembly written by the New York City Assembly. What it showed was that this pattern given to us by God was organic. It was flexible. It was able to constantly add new levels of complexity. And it was moving beyond personality. These were institutions. How many of you here can name all 9 members of the Universal House of Justice? You see it as an institution, not as the individuals who serve on it. The founding of the Baha'i Administrative Order is the most significant turning point in the establishment of mankind's government. We look to historic moments where democracy started rearing its head, primarily in Europe. We think about Athens, the Magna Carta in England, and then the experimental box of the English colonies with the first 30 years of the Virginia legislative body, and then the Mayflower Compact, and then, of course, the political geniuses who set up our current system, and the period of the Revolution, and with the writing of the US Constitution. But friends, this makes them all pale, because this is from God. This is for the whole world. And it doesn't matter what kind of system of government a culture has had in the past. This pattern is going to work for everyone, and we are proving that across the world with more than 157 national spiritual assemblies. So with that,
thank you so much for that, Kathy. It's a really wonderful reminder how sometimes these seemingly insignificant moments actually are the seed of a new pattern of civilization. So thank you. This was a lovely overview of that period of time. We're going to move now to some more contemporary reflections. So I'm going to turn now to Ken. Ken has served as the Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States for almost 19 years. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly for 5 years, and before that, Secretary of the National Teaching Committee for 9 years. So it's over 3 decades of service at the national level. So Ken, can you tell us what stands out to you, looking back over that period of time? What were some of the most significant developments of the Baha'i community and the Baha'i Administrative Order, looking back?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see sort of all of you with the spotlights in front of us. It's very difficult to encapsulate 3 decades or so very easily in the few minutes that we have, but if I were to choose one phrase, I would say that the chief development in the administrative order, and indeed I think in the entire culture of the Baha'i community, not just in the United States, but I would say arguably around the world, has been in our capacity for learning. And I think it has undergone a profound change over the course of the past generation and has brought us to a point now where the real potentials of the faith to transform the life of society are becoming more and more obvious. Now, when we say learning, let me just preface what I'm about to say by reminding us of something that Kathryn Mackay shared with us at the top of the evening, which was, when we think of learning, we can't think simply in terms of an intellectual exercise. Now, the intellect is involved, yes, of course, but there's not a dichotomy between the intellect and the heart, the mind and the heart. These two things go together. So when we say learning, what we're referring to is a deeply profound, yes, exercise of the mind and of the rational soul, but also an exercise of the spirit. And the two come together and give us something that is quite different, I think, than anything else that is going on in the world. And I think that's part of the magic that Kathy was talking about. Now, of course, based on Kathy's wonderful comments just now and this beautiful video that we saw, it's very clear that the Baha'i community always has been in a mode of learning. So it's not to say that just in the past generation we began to learn things, but no, there have been brilliant people who have learned amazing things over the course of time. But those things really were just the foundational elements, if you will, of this magnificent system that we're building. And largely that learning happened with certainly today we have the Universal House of Justice, thank God, to guide our learning process. In those days, we had We had Baha'u'llah himself in his own time, and then we had the Master, and we had Shoghi Effendi. But in the last generation or so, the House of Justice itself took very important steps to push the process of learning further down into the ranks of the community, and to instill in us all a greater consciousness of that process of learning in and of itself. So to give some examples of that, in 1986, at the beginning of the 6-year plan, the Universal House of Justice made the announcement that in this case, in that plan, it would offer to the Baha'i world general aims, which we would all pursue, general goals that we would all pursue, but that for the first time in history, national spiritual assemblies would be responsible, based on those general goals, to set their own national goals in consultation with the counselors. So significant was that step that the House of Justice characterized that alone as marking a new stage, a new epoch in the formative age of the faith. So that launched us on our 4th epoch of the formative age, just that fact. Now, why was that important? Because until then, all of the goals of the various plans had been set by the head of the faith, whoever that was at that time. So the House of Justice for a number of years, and before that, obviously, Shoghi Effendi had set those goals, right down to how many local assemblies would be formed, how many nations would be opened, languages would be translated, and so on and so forth. But it was the head of the faith. And now, we were being called upon on national spiritual assemblies with the counselors to read our own reality in the light of those goals, as we would now put it. And in the light of that reality, in light of what we saw as our potential and what we could achieve in those goals, set our own goals and try to achieve them, and then, of course, engage in our own level of reflection about how we were doing, how we were progressing. Now, that decision was augmented very famously just a decade later with the establishment of instruments by the Universal House of Justice to push the process of planning and goal setting even further down. One was the creation of regional Baha'i councils in various countries of the world. The other, of course, the establishment worldwide of the institute process. And that latter one, really most of all, was the one that created for us, together with the institute itself, but the guidance that the House of Justice launched it with, the idea of a framework for action that would evolve as we continue to learn. Now, in the past generation since then, a lot has happened, and I'm only going to touch on a few ways that I've seen, at least in the United States, but perhaps also in Canada, things have changed in the culture of the Baha'i community as a result of the Institute and that learning process. So one of them is simply the idea that there is a coherent framework of action. Now, this was not something that actually existed 30 years ago. Now, maybe it existed, there was guidance, it was in the writings, but it's not to say it wasn't there in the guidance, but we just didn't understand it. So the result of that was, and in the 90s, I served on the National Teaching Committee. So part of that role was to go around the United States and have meetings with the Friends, and we would talk about the growth of the faith and the teaching work, this notion of how do we advance the process of entry by troops. And in those conversations, it was very clear that there was no sense of how we were really going to go about that. So inevitably, to give just an anecdotal sense of it, we would be in a meeting with the Friends, and one friend would stand up and say, well, the key to entry by troops is firesides. And here's my quote from Shoghi Effendi to prove it. And then the next person inevitably would get up and say, no, the key is mass teaching, and here's my quote from Shoghi Effendi to prove it. And then the next person, no, it's living the life, and here's my quote from Shoghi Effendi to prove it. So everyone's quoting the same guardian and coming to very different conclusions because it was kind of a one-dimensional thing. We'd never really put it together. Then the House of Justice itself issued a compilation and statement called Promoting Entry by Troops, which made very clear that growth is a multifaceted endeavor that we would have to pursue in all of its facets, but also, very importantly, it would be something that we would have to learn to do over the course of time. So it introduced this idea, and also introduced the idea that a diversity of activity required a diversity of services. And the House famously said in that letter that no one person can do everything, nor should all people do the same thing in order to advance that process. So based on that, we began to think and learn over the course of the year. So one was just to have that framework of thought that unified us. One of the important results of that framework was that it allowed us to have a far more sustained commitment to what we were doing. There was a time when, and some of you may have been Baha'is long enough to remember that, we would have a big plan for a teaching campaign in our community, and there would be a parade and balloons and all this sort of thing, and Project Badash was on its way, or Tabarsi or whatever we wanted to do. And 6 months later, hey, whatever happened to that teaching plan? Does that sound familiar to those who are veterans? Yes, because what would happen is we would set certain goals, and we would hasten to judge them as either complete successes or abject failures, but not take the time to say, well, what did we learn from this? And how might we refine our activities? This was just not really a part of the cultural conversation that we were having. So with the idea that we had a framework, we had to say, well, all right, well, maybe my study circle this time wasn't as effective, or my junior youth group, it kind of petered out after a while, or what have you. So what did I learn from this, and how can I do better next time? How can we help each other do better next time? That was really the thing that it did. And so it freed us from this sort of freneticism that had been going on for a long time. And that commitment over the course of many years led to another very important capacity, I think, on the part of the institutions of the faith, which was the ability to build systems that facilitate that learning, especially at the grassroots. That is, systems that would facilitate the flow of information and guidance, and not only the generation, but also the dissemination of insights from what was going on. And of course, this again, not just in the United States or Canada, but the House of Justice advanced this process of learning around the world. Now we have a situation when we talk about universal participation, there is now also universal contribution to our worldwide learning. Something that they learn in Tuvalu, or a village in India, that is an insight in the process of growth, will benefit potentially people living in Chicago, Illinois, or in Ontario. This is the way the system now has been built because of that commitment, because we've stayed with it for so long. Just a couple of more thoughts. One is the whole idea of that we're in an attitude of learning. That is the humility and the patience and the willingness from those things to entertain, that I may not have all of the answers, but together with those who are working with me, we will be able to find those answers. And it has given us an ability also to reach out to others who are also learning. That is, people who are not necessarily formally enrolled in the Baha'i Faith. And this too is a huge cultural change that has taken place in the last generation. Now, of course, I think we all knew at some level that all of the peoples of the world would contribute to the building of a new civilization. I personally wouldn't say there was any time in my life as a Baha'i, having grown up as a Baha'i, that I didn't think that. But this gave us a more concrete and systematic and real way to realize that aspiration, that all people would contribute to something. And I would say that it changed the thinking, particularly of the older generation of Baha'is, in a very important way. The way I've encapsulated that before has been that when I grew up as a Baha'i youth, when we would go out and teach, back in the days that they called the mass teaching days, we would say, become a Baha'i and help us change the world. Now we say, help us change the world. And if you're willing to do that, great. And yes, eventually, yes, you're welcome to become a Baha'i if you're so inclined. You can go on your spiritual journey, but the key is that we're together. We're figuring these things out, and we realize that every group of people in the world has some contribution to make to the advancement of our society, building that spiritual world that Baha'u'llah has envisioned. And then now, as we enter the second century of the formative age, which brings me to my final idea, is that having sustained this process for this amount of time, the House of Justice now has told us, so it's not me saying it, it's the House of Justice, that we can now begin to see, particularly in the most advanced clusters that we have and that exist in the world, the the way in which the society-building powers that are inherent in the revelation of Baha'u'llah will have their effect. They will be released in ever greater measures throughout the course of this plan and the series of plans that will take us into the middle of the century and beyond. This is an extremely important thing to see because we know that part of our spiritual mission, we are the co-addressees of the advent of divine justice. This letter of the Guardian was sent not just to the American Baha'is, but to the Canadians as well. It was to the Baha'is of North America. And in it, the Guardian spoke of the rampant materialism, the moral laxity, the corruption, and of course the ingrained racial prejudice that impede our society and prevent it from fulfilling the great destiny to usher in the most great peace. And that the Baha'is have a certain contribution to make in assisting our fellow citizens to purge ourselves of these, to which we are not immune, by the way, but of these terrible tendencies that are endemic in our society. But it's through, we can now see this same framework of action that the resolution of those issues can be made. And this is very, very clear. And so now we can perhaps get a glimpse of what the Guardian said about the will of the Master early in his ministry. This is quoted in the House of Justice's letter of November 28, 2023, Reflections on the First Century of the Formative Age, as we know it. Something?
Parents, please pick up your
Oh, parents, okay. Parents, please. It's not about what I'm going to say. It's something else. It's something else. The Guardian wrote, we return to our theme. The Guardian wrote, the contents of the will of the Master are far too much for the present generation to comprehend. It needs at least a century of actual working before the treasures of wisdom hidden in it can be revealed. Now, of course, the Guardian did not say it would take exactly a century, but he said at least a century. But now that we're in, that first century, we've completed that century, and we're beginning the second one, I think it's possible to look at some of these places and say, yes, we're beginning to see perhaps what the potential that is enshrined in that will and testament is all about and how the world will change. If you go, a lot of this footage was about the Triangle Cluster. Most of it was from the Triangle Cluster, which is in the state of North Carolina in the United States. And in that cluster, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of people who are interacting with the Word of God for today and learning individually and collectively to engage in ever more complex acts of service, reading their own community realities, taking action based on those realities, consulting, reflecting. They have a sense of empowerment, a sense of agency. They come literally from just about any conceivable background. It's a highly diverse cluster. And in a spirit of love, they are building relationships, real relationships of friendship, of trust, of unity, of prayer, of reliance on each other, but of course also reliance on God. And what is happening there is amazing. And the vast majority of those involved are not formal members of the Bahá'í Faith, but many of them who have not perhaps formally registered would consider themselves spiritually deeply connected to Baha'u'llah, if not Baha'is in their heart. And the day will come, when groups of them will enter, eventually then troops of them will enter, as is promised.
Thank you so much, Ken. Those are some really wonderful reflections on our evolving capacity for learning and refining our efforts now in light of a framework, and where the Baha'i community is now poised to release the society-building powers of the faith. So we're going to turn to our final speaker, to you, Michael. In some of your academic work, you've explored how governance systems reflect assumptions about power, about human nature and progress. And from that academic lens, can you tell us some of the distinctive features of the Baha'i system of governance And what makes it fundamentally different from what we see in political and institutional structures around the world? And maybe if you can add how you've learned to describe some of these features in your contributions to professional and academic discourses.
Thanks. So there are so many features, some of which have been touched on already tonight, that are distinctive about our system of governance. But I want to say I learned about a new feature, a distinctive feature tonight from Kathryn's comments that has really confirmed my faith. Because I didn't know until tonight that this institution we're reflecting on today was conceived in a pool hall. and those of you who know me out there know I love a good game of pool. So I feel like I've reached the city of certitude now. But I haven't worked out how to talk about that distinctive feature with my academic peers yet. So let me focus on a couple of others I've thought more deeply about. I think really one of the fundamental structural features is, as has been mentioned already, we have an electoral system that is free of any form of competition. Sometimes we describe the system as nonpartisan and so forth, but it's much more fundamental than that. When, I think many of you probably had this experience, describing the nature of an election in which everyone has complete freedom of choice and there's no competition, it's actually hard for most people to comprehend because elections are synonymous with competition in the Western liberal imagination. So this is something that's actually beyond the sort of horizons of the imaginations of certainly most of my academic peers. And why is this significant? Well, I think we can say a few things about, a system that is without the principle of competition. Electoral competition, it's about structuring elections as contests of power. And this is one of the fundamental sources of political corruption in liberal democracies. Because this is what invites the corrupting influence of ego and money and other things we could get into. But it's also, in fact, what builds pressures to create or join parties. Because parties are machines for effectively aggregating the powers to win electoral contests. So this is a very fundamental structural feature that I think we really have to learn to convey clearly so that people and explore the implications of this in academic and other contexts. Another feature, of course, that distinguishes the system of governance from Western liberal democracies is making decisions without oppositional debate. The principles of consultation we're all quite familiar with, I'm sure. Many people have written about this, including in the context of sort of Baha'i governance. But what does this give us? It gives us a decision-making process that unifies people in the search for truth. It unifies people in their processes of trying to discern the best course of collective action and then learn their way forward. Oppositional debate, along with the electoral contest of power, divides people and undermines the ability of governing institutions to operate in learning modes over time. Now, those are probably fairly familiar features. Another one I think is very familiar to most of us in this room, but is quite difficult to articulate in an academic context is this. Baha'i governance involves the systematic application of spiritual principles or spiritual truths in decision-making. How does one explain that in a largely secular academic environment? So I think this is something that we're still working out, sort of language and concepts that are digestible, that, by which we can do this. I know I've spent a fair bit of time in my second book trying to sort of work out some of this. And, we can draw here on traditions that help us do this. So, for instance, in the Western philosophical tradition, we can draw on the concept of normative truths, which is in many ways a synonym for what we would call spiritual principles. That we operate on the premise that there are normative truths about how humans ought to live, that are in fact objective features of reality in the same way that gravity is. These are truths that are woven into the fabric of existence. We're trying to learn to apply them systematically then to the governance of human affairs, to promote human flourishing. This is something we can work out how to begin to offer in academic contexts. Another, I think, principle that we are beginning to try to explore and think about how do you offer, especially in sort of secular academic context, is that our system, we have a structure like our electoral system, but it only functions in the context of a culture that grows around it. So we assume that actually governance, our structure and our culture has to co-evolve to support this. You couldn't impose a Baha'i electoral model on a population that hadn't developed the culture that enables it to work. And we've spent the last 100 years co-evolving these things. So we understand what it means if someone, for instance, expressed, the desire to be elected, expressed the confidence that they were the best, able to serve the community. We actually have a culture that understands this is actually a signal of lacking the qualities that we would want to. But that's a cultural thing we've come to understand. Another aspect of our system that's very related to this is, and it's part of this culture, but this is a system that relies on the systematic cultivation of spiritual qualities and attitudes and virtues. The system doesn't work without that. It's not just a structure. It's a structure that has to be populated by souls who are striving to embody certain qualities. And so in this regard, of course, for 100 years we've been trying to learn how to cultivate these. What we have now is actually a network of training institutes that spans the globe that's enabling us to, with increasing, sort of systematic ways, foster these qualities in growing, ever-expanding numbers of people, beginning with the youngest generations. And this training institute couples that process of cultivating the requisite qualities and attitudes that our system of governance needs. It couples that with also cultivating concrete skills and abilities. How to consult, how to elect, and many other things that we could talk about. So, a dear friend of mine in the audience here is fond of saying that, the theory and practice of Western liberal democracy has a training institute-sized hole in it. This is actually a distinctive feature of our system of governance. And I think we haven't fully worked out, even in our own minds, how the training institute is in fact becoming an inseparable feature of the evolution of our system of governance. These are co-evolving, aspects of what we're learning to do. So, my thoughts are very brief. These are just, a few thoughts. But to sort of invite those of you out here who are moving in discourses, academic, professional discourses, for whom some of, like the Baha'i system of governance, might have insights to offer, to really push ourselves, advance ourselves to think, how do we work out the language, the concepts that are relevant to the very specific discourses we're involved in, so that we can offer the experiences of this community. Not in a triumphalist way, we certainly haven't, figured it all out, but with a kind of unapologetic confidence that we have a set of principles that have already offered a kind of provisional evidence that they work, and that they offer a path towards a new level of maturity in governance. And how do we begin to offer these principles? Now, I know there are also already people in this audience. I've tried to do some of this work. There are other people in this audience doing this work. So, Michael Sabet, who's out there somewhere in the blinding light, which, by the way, you thought there were spotlights. I thought there were blinding halos above everybody's heads. This amazing audience here. But, Michael Sabet's doing a political science doctoral dissertation on Baha'i governance, trying to work out some of these things. He recently co-authored a wonderful peer-reviewed article with Todd Smith, also in the audience here, on transcending partisanship that was published in a peer-reviewed journal. Roshan Danesh, who many of you know, a very distinguished Canadian legal scholar, has written an excellent article on how the Baha'i Faith is fundamentally reframing the sort of liberal democratic notion of church and state. A very significant feature of understanding Baha'i governance. Arash Abizadeh, a distinguished political philosopher at McGill University in Quebec, has written some outstanding articles on Baha'i elections. And a recent Routledge volume titled The World of the Baha'i Faith, edited by Robert Stockman, who I suspect is somewhere out in the audience, contains a number of excellent chapters on Baha'i governance. Other examples could be cited, but my point is simply this. Our distinctive system of governance is emerging as a legitimate object of academic inquiry. And it offers provisional evidence that can be a source of hope for humanity's future. And this is only going to increase in time as the size of our community grows, so people become more interested in what we have to say, and as our contributions to the betterment of humanity grow and gain more attention. And on this note, let me just sort of leave you with these words from the House of Justice, which I think we heard an echo of earlier, right? As the contributions being made by the faith to the progress of society in different parts of the world gains greater visibility, the Baha'i community will increasingly be called upon to explicate the principles it advocates and to demonstrate their applicability to the issues facing humanity. The more the intellectual life of a community blossoms and thrives, the greater its capacity to answer this call. It will be up to the followers of Baha'u'llah to provide in the world of ideas the intellectual rigor and clarity of thought to match their commitment to spiritual and material progress in the world of deeds. So how do we bring insights from our experience with governance into these contexts is one of the questions in front of us. Now, I've been asked to sort of close the panel tonight, and I want to close by actually looking ahead to the panel tomorrow night just for a moment. Because we've been looking at these distinctive features of Baha'i governance as among those aspects of the society-building powers we've been called to release in ever greater measure. Tomorrow night, we're going to have a panel that will invite us to think deeply about social action and contributing to discourse and the relationship between them as other aspects of these society-building powers. We have some very special guests here tonight who have been working for many years with Fundiak in Colombia. Many of you are aware of them. They're going to share insights from a book they've recently authored on this experience, which is, by the way, in our bookstore. I would encourage you, if you want to sort of glance at this even before the talk. It's a gem of a book. So we look forward to sort of continuing the conversation tomorrow night along this theme. And again, it's been a pleasure to be part of this panel. Thank you. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We wish you a wonderful conference. Have a wonderful evening.